I started out as a graphic designer. So I started doing graphic design maybe about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and I learned originally as a sort of fine artist, and but I didn't pursue art as a career. But when I started doing graphic design for a career, suddenly started getting interested in fine art again, and basically I had an opportunity to exhibit at a university show down in Southampton where I was living at the time, and once I kind of showed some work in one spot, I found that I really liked making art, and so I kept going from there. My original pieces were actually mostly just paintings, paintings on cardboard boxes. I would find cardboard box in the refuse bin and paint it, often to look almost like a Greek vase. I was interested in the idea of a container with decoration on it, which is obviously what Greek vases are, but also what modern-day packaging is like. So I liked the way that you have all this sort of content, like myths and narratives, and everything that's kind of important to a society at the time gets put into the pictures on their, well, in our case, packaging. In the case of ancient Greeks, it was their vases. The Egyptians have sarcophagi. So I found this kind of theme of decorated containers running through history. And so in many ways, this is a kind of an updated version of all those kind of historical forms. Graphic War was funded by the Liverpool Trust, and is basically myself in partnership with Leeds Museums and Galleries. And the idea was to look at the graphic design of the First World War and find a way to kind of turn that into artworks that would interest people both in museums and in artwork, and to want to know more about the First World War. So I applied for the Liverpool grant with Lucy Moore, the curator of First World War at Leeds Museums and Galleries, and we got the grant, which was great, and then we had 10 months to put together the project. We wanted to look at kind of 4 key themes, one for each of the large artworks that were in the project, and the sculptures were kind of in a trail around the city, so that people would sort of find one, maybe be curious to look at the others, but in any way almost be sort of ambushed by the artwork, and appeal to people who wouldn't necessarily be going to the museum or going to a gallery. So they walked around the city and they sort of found the pieces, and they were hopefully interested in the different themes we were approaching, like women in war. We were looking at the idea of sort of wounded in the war. We were also looking at things like some of the early almost excitement about the war from a technological perspective. Artists especially were quite interested in things like the tanks and the aesthetics of the war until they realized just how horrible the war was. So things like that sort of went into the artworks. And after the completion of the project, which happened in November 2015, we dismantled the whole thing, and now it's come down to the National Archives. So I'm really happy to have all the pieces here, and we've made a little sculpture trail through the archives. In each way, of course, I like every separate piece. I think when you spend that long making an artwork, you do get really attached to it. But I think I have maybe sort of 2 favorites. I think my first favorite is the one called Blast, which looks like a sort of a machine gunner, mostly because that was the first one that came to mind when I thought of the whole exhibition, and it just, for me, was the one that encapsulated everything. And also it's the one we used in the posters for the advertisement of the show. So something about it is just maybe the most iconic piece. But I think the one that I also like the most is called Enemy of the Stars, and it's one shaped like a zeppelin, a crashing zeppelin. Also, it looks like a peace dove, and I think partly why I like that one so much is just because it was so difficult to design. So it was the most complicated, and maybe just because it was just so painful to make, I kind of have a special, part of my heart that just always kind of likes looking at it. So the artworks basically start with a sketch, just to get my ideas down. They were all based on research into the museum collection, so everything was, in some ways, had an artifact that was the basis. So I would sort of translate that artifact into a more stylized kind of design, or sort of mix artifacts together. Once I knew what sort of the concept was going to be, basically I did a pencil sketch of what it would look like from a couple different angles. Then I basically just draw the artwork in Adobe Illustrator, which is a 2D software. I design all the pieces in 2D rather than using 3D software, mostly because it gives me a bit more control over how the whole thing is designed. There's just so many little parts that go into each of the sculptures that I actually find it easier to begin designing it flat rather than actually as a 3D shape. So I basically just spend a long time going through it and figuring out what all the different angles need to be for each of the pieces of the sculpture. Once I've done what I think is the right set of designs, I print a copy just on white paper or thick white paper. I make a little model and I see if it works. And if there's any little mistakes, I go and fix them in the main design. And then I just basically have the design that I cover in pictures. And after that, I print it on digitally printed corrugated cardboard and slice it up with a scalpel and fold all the parts together. In almost every case, I make the sculptures in lots of smaller pieces, mostly because I don't have room to store each of these sculptures in my studio. So I've made them so they can all sort of come apart, and then the parts kind of flat pack more easily so we can transport them. So at the end, it's quite fun. It's a bit like putting together a piece of Lego or IKEA furniture. You just click everything together, and voila, you got a sculpture.